Hey, what's up, Thought Spiral fam? Welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the biggest issues that matter. And today we're talking about something that's hitting way closer to home than most of us realize: climate migration. Last week, Hurricane Helene, this massive 420-mile-wide beast of a storm, ripped through parts of Florida and North Carolina. It didn't just wreck homes and bridges, it shook people's faith in the idea that the South is still a safe place to live. Extreme heat, storms, rising sea levels. It's all adding up real fast. People are starting to feel the heat. Literally. Now, Helene isn't just another storm. No. It's part of a new generation of storms that are getting stronger and dumping more rain as the climate warms. And this is just the kind of thing that's pushing more and more Americans to rethink where they live. Researchers are now estimating that tens of millions of people might eventually have to leave areas that are too hot, too dry, or too prone to wildfires, storms, or floods. And yeah, people are still moving to high-risk areas, lured by air conditioning and sunny weather, but it's becoming clearer by the day that these places are not as safe as they once seemed. And it's not just theory, guys. A study from the First Street Foundation found that 3.2 million Americans have already moved, like right now, from flood-prone areas. We're talking about places like low-lying parts of Staten Island, Miami, and Galveston, Texas. Over the next 30 years, another 7.5 million are expected to leave these flood zones. This could spark a boom for inland and northern cities, but the flip side is that large coastal areas will be left behind, with seniors and low-income families being the ones most likely to stay behind, trapped in vulnerable areas. And that's where it gets really complicated. Because as more people leave, those who remain are going to face even bigger challenges: higher costs of living, less prosperity, and a government that might not have the resources to help. Climate change isn't just a future problem, it's happening now. And the migration that comes with it is going to reshape this country in ways we're not even fully prepared for. So, what do you guys think? Should more people be moving away from these high-risk areas, or should we be investing in better infrastructure to protect them? Let me know in the comments. And, of course, hit that subscribe button if you want more of these deep dives. This is The Thought Spiral, and we'll see you next time. So, as we go deeper, it's clear the Southern U.S. is going to feel the brunt of these changes. We're talking about extreme heat, more storms, and major coastal flooding. For the bottom third of the country, life's getting less comfortable, more expensive, and definitely less prosperous. And here's the thing: who's going to leave first? It's going to be the younger, mobile, middle-class folks, chasing better opportunities and safer places to live. That leaves behind seniors, the poor, and those without the means to relocate. And for these people, life's going to get a lot harder. Local and federal governments are going to have to step up here. They can't just leave these communities to fend for themselves. We're talking about an aging population that's going to need more services, more medical care, and more physical accommodations. And if the population keeps shrinking, that could mean less representation in Congress too. Yep, their voice could get smaller just when they need it most. Now, what's interesting is that this isn't just happening in the South or on the coasts. Some of these abandonment zones are popping up in places like the inland Northeast and even the upper Midwest. But predictably, many of them fall in areas already prone to storm surges from weather events like Hurricane Helene. In Florida and Texas, for instance, some low-lying coastal areas are already seeing population declines. And this might just be the beginning. First Street identified over 818,000 census blocks that have already passed tipping points for abandonment. That's a total of more than 16 million people living in areas where out-migration has already started. And it's not just a small trickle of people leaving. It's enough to potentially reverse the population growth we've seen in places like Florida. This suggests a massive shift is coming, one that could completely reshape the regions we think of as desirable places to live. And while we can't predict the future with total accuracy, yeah, these projections could be off, the fact that we're even talking about the retreat of American communities is a big deal. This wasn't even in the climate change conversation until pretty recently. Yep, you heard that right. Places like Florida, which have been growing consistently, might actually start losing people as climate pressures rise by the middle of this century. We could see counties across these states experience a population decline, something that hasn't really been on the radar before. Now, could these projections turn out to be wrong? Sure. The more specific the modeling, the bigger the margin of error. But the fact that researchers are already pinpointing communities that might need to retreat is a major shift in how we're thinking about climate change. And it's not just about moving away. Other research is shining a light on who exactly will be most affected. Demographer Matthew Hauer from Florida State University, the guy who estimates that 13 million Americans will be displaced by rising sea levels, has been diving into what this migration could mean for the age of those who stay behind. So, what are we looking at here? According to Hauer, the population that remains in these vulnerable regions will likely get a lot older. In places like coastal Florida and along the Gulf Coast, the median age could increase by 10 years by the end of this century. That's 10 years faster than it would without climate migration. This means we're going to see a much older population, particularly women, who tend to live longer, facing the greatest physical dangers in these areas. The overlap between the places Hauer says will age and the zones people are already abandoning is really concerning. The fact is, as younger people leave, these towns could spiral into a population death trap. Older residents are more likely to be retired, which means they're not contributing as much to the local tax base. That means less money for schools, infrastructure, and dealing with environmental changes, just as the cost of all those things is going up. So not only are these communities losing people, they're losing the ability to keep up with the very changes that are pushing people out in the first place. It's a vicious cycle, and it's one that could trigger even more outmigration in the future. All of this raises a huge question. Are we really prepared for what climate migration is going to do to American communities? Because if we're not paying attention, a lot of people, particularly the most vulnerable, are going to get left behind. All right, so let's take this a step further. As more young people leave these areas, what's left behind is an older population, and that comes with its own set of dangers. In fact, older adults, especially women who tend to live longer, are likely to face the most physical danger in these climate-vulnerable regions. There's a noticeable overlap between the places where climate-driven migration is happening and where the population is aging rapidly. And that's where things could really start to spiral. As towns get older, they could enter what experts are calling a population death spiral. With fewer young people around to contribute to the local economy, the tax base erodes. And that means less money for schools, for infrastructure, and most importantly, for the kinds of services that aging populations are going to need more than ever. This shrinking tax base creates a vicious cycle. As these places become less financially viable, more people are going to leave, which then makes it even harder for local governments to manage the growing costs of climate change. It's a situation that's almost guaranteed to lead to more outmigration. And the challenges don't stop there. In many coastal areas, one of the solutions being talked about is raising homes to deal with rising sea levels. But here's the thing, that's not exactly practical in areas with an older population. As Matthew Hauer pointed out, adding more steps to homes isn't really going to help the elderly. In fact, it could make things worse. In other areas, older residents will rely even more on emergency services. And if we're being honest, many of these services are already stretched thin, as we've seen with Hurricane Helene. Some of the storm's victims were simply cut off, stranded without any real help, which shows just how dangerous the gaps in our infrastructure really are. So, the future's clear. Authorities are going to have to rethink how they provide services, what kind of vehicles they use, and how they can keep these isolated, often flooded communities connected. It's not going to be easy, and it's definitely not going to be cheap. But here's the bigger takeaway from all of this. Many of the effects of climate change aren't going to be sudden or dramatic. They're going to be subtle, maybe even unexpected. And we could be looking at a future where the demographics of this country look completely different than anything we're familiar with. It's not just about the storms, the heat, or the rising seas. It's about who gets left behind when the dust settles. We need to start thinking about this now, not just as a nation, but as individuals, as communities. Because if we don't, a lot of people could find themselves trapped in places that are no longer safe. So what do you guys think? Are we ready to face this future, or are we ignoring the warning signs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, hit that like button if you found this video helpful. Don't forget to subscribe and join us here at the Thought Spiral for more deep dives like this. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.